Widow helps a biker fix his bike. The next day, 50 Hells Angels show up. The autumn wind whistled through the trees. On a lonely stretch of highway, Jack Thompson's heavy motorcycle gave one final sputter before dying completely. He was examining the engine when a pair of headlights appeared. An old station wagon pulled up, and an elderly woman, Ellie Miller, stepped out. "Having trouble?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. She didn't wait for his gruff reply. Ellie pulled a small flashlight from her pocket, peering at the engine with experienced eyes. Her movements were sure and practiced. "Ah," she said after a moment, pointing to a spot. "Loose spark plug." Without waiting, she reached in, her aged fingers moving with surprising dexterity, and tightened the connection. Jack swung his leg over the seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life, its familiar rumble filling the night air. Ellie offered him tea from a thermos. "Kindness isn't something you can put a price on," she said, shaking her head firmly when he offered money. Jack accepted the tea, his guard lowered, but the moment was shattered by a sound that made his body stiffen. In the distance, the distinctive sound of multiple motorcycles broke through the night's quiet. His expression changed instantly, all traces of softness vanishing. "I need to go," he said quickly, swinging onto his bike. "Stay safe, ma'am." Without another word, he kicked the engine to life and roared off into the darkness, leaving Ellie standing alone on the empty highway. Ellie watched the approaching headlights intensify, the rhythmic thunder of the bikes growing louder. She recognized the sound and, more importantly, the urgency in Jack's departure. As the first headlights rounded the bend, she saw the formation, a dozen bikes, moving fast, searching. They were Black Pistons, and their presence on this stretch of road meant only one thing: they were hunting a stray. Ellie stepped off the shoulder and into the middle of the road, facing the oncoming convoy. She switched on her small flashlight and, using her tea-filled thermos cap, began to signal. The lead bike, traveling at speed, was forced to slam on its brakes, the others swerving wildly to avoid a pileup. The entire pack screeched to a halt mere feet from the elderly woman. The leader, a huge man with a scarred face, dismounted immediately, rage etched across his features. "What the hell do you think you're doing, old woman?" he roared, his voice thick with threat. Ellie didn't flinch. She simply pointed her small flashlight at the broken taillight of her station wagon. "My apologies, gentlemen. I've broken down. My brake lights went out. I was trying to warn you about the oil spill that man on the Harley just left behind." The bikers exchanged wary glances. An oil spill at high speed could wipe out half the pack. "Harley?" the leader growled. "Suspicious." "Yes, went that way," she said, pointing in the opposite direction of Jack's escape. "Riding like the devil himself was after him," said his oil line burst. The leader looked at his men, then back at the calm, silver-haired woman standing in the path of their hunt. He weighed the risk of a dangerous oil slick against the word of a seemingly harmless old woman. "Let's move," he barked, kicking his bike to life. "Forget the oil, but we're going that way." He pointed down the road Ellie had indicated. The bikers roared past her, disappearing in the wrong direction, their thunder fading into the night. Ellie stood on the empty highway until the last sound of their engines was gone. She walked back to her station wagon, poured herself another cup of tea, and smiled gently. "You're welcome, Jack Thompson," she whispered, getting back into her car. "That's how you put a price on kindness." The morning sun filtered through the autumn leaves as Ellie knelt in her garden, her hands deep in the cool soil. Her flower beds needed attention before winter set in. And the routine. Task gave her time to think about the strange encounter from the night before. The mysterious biker's face kept appearing in her mind, his rough exterior masking what seemed like a gentler soul underneath. She pulled a stubborn weed from between her prized dahlias, brushing dirt from her worn gardening gloves. "What an odd fellow," she murmured to herself, remembering how quickly he'd disappeared into the darkness. The morning was peaceful, with only the soft chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then she felt it, a low vibration in the ground that made her pause. At first, she thought it might be a passing truck on the highway, but the rumbling grew stronger, building into a thunderous roar that seemed to come from every direction. Ellie slowly stood up, her knees protesting the movement as she steadied herself against a nearby fence post. In the distance, a cloud of dust rose above the tree line. The rumbling grew louder, and then she saw them. Motorcycles, dozens of them, their chrome gleaming in the morning sun. They poured onto her property like a black leathered tide, their engines creating a deafening chorus that sent her chickens scattering in panic. Ellie's heart pounded as she watched the motorcycles fill her driveway, spilling onto the grass. There must have been 50 of them, their riders sitting tall and proud on their machines, the air filled with the smell of exhaust and leather as the engines finally fell silent, leaving an eerie quiet in their wake. From among the crowd, a massive figure emerged. He stood at least 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a thick beard shot through with gray. His face bore deep scars, telling stories of battles Ellie didn't want to imagine. He walked toward her with purposeful steps, his boots crushing the grass beneath them. "Ma'am," his voice rumbled, deep and gravelly. "I'm Vince Tanner, though most folks call me Grizzly." He gestured to the assembled bikers behind him. "We're the Hells Angels, and we heard you helped one of our brothers last night." Ellie's mouth felt dry. "It was nothing," she managed to say, her voice smaller than she would have liked. "Just a loose spark plug." Grizzly's scarred face broke into what might have been a smile. "Nothing to you, maybe. But we don't forget our debts. You helped Jack, and now we're here to help you." "Oh, no," Ellie protested, finding her voice. "That's really not necessary. I didn't help him expecting anything in return." "That's exactly why we're here," Grizzly said firmly. "True kindness is rare in our world. We pay our debts, whether folks want us to or not." Before Ellie could object further, the bikers began moving. They unstrapped tools and supplies from their motorcycles, hammers, power tools, lumber, and more. They moved with military precision, spreading out across her property like they'd planned this invasion down to the smallest detail. Ellie stood rooted to the spot, watching as these leather-clad strangers began working on her broken fence, clearing debris from her yard, and assessing her weathered barn. Her mind struggled to process the scene before her. Dozens of tattooed, tough-looking men and women, all focused on helping her, all because she'd fixed a spark plug in the dark. She clutched her gardening gloves tightly, caught between gratitude and apprehension. What had her simple act of kindness gotten her into? The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ellie's property as she sat on her weathered porch swing, watching the unusual scene unfold before her. Her normally quiet yard had transformed into a bustling worksite. Leather-clad bikers moved with purpose, their tattoos glistening with sweat as they repaired fences, cleared debris, and restored her old barn to its former glory. From her vantage point, Ellie noticed how organized they were, working in small groups with an efficiency that surprised her. One group tackled the sagging roof of her barn, while others cleared overgrown brush and repaired the split-rail fence that hadn't seen attention in years. "Would you look at that?" she murmured to herself, watching as two burly men carefully transplanted her prized rose bushes to a better spot in the garden. They handled the delicate plants with unexpected gentleness, their huge hands moving with careful precision. Among the workers, she spotted Jack. Unlike last night, when he'd seemed tense and guarded, there was an ease to his movements now. He worked methodically, showing others how to properly secure fence posts. When he glanced up, their eyes met briefly. His nod was slight, almost shy. so different from the man who'd rushed away in the darkness just hours ago. The late afternoon heat prompted Ellie to action. She went inside and prepared several pitchers of iced tea, adding fresh mint from her garden. Loading them onto her serving tray, she stepped back outside, calling out, "Anyone thirsty?" The work paused as bikers gathered around, accepting glasses with grateful nods and mumbled thanks. Ellie noticed how they maintained a respectful distance, careful not to crowd her. Their manners were rough but genuine. Jack approached last, hanging back until the others had dispersed. His hands were dirty from work, and he wiped them on his jeans before accepting a glass. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "Not just for this, but for last night, too. I wasn't. I should have." "You don't need to explain," Ellie replied, watching him struggle with the words. "No, I do," he insisted, his eyes meeting hers. "What you did, stopping to help a stranger, especially someone who looked like—" He gestured to himself, the tattoos visible on his arms, the worn leather vest. Most people would have kept driving. Ellie poured herself a glass of tea, considering his words. "Maybe those people miss out on seeing what's really there," she said simply. Something in Jack's expression softened, a glimpse of vulnerability showing through his tough exterior. He looked down at his glass, turning it slowly in his hands. "Maybe they do." As the sun began to set, Ellie gathered the empty glasses and headed back inside. Through her screen door, she could see Jack talking with a small group of bikers near the newly repaired fence. Their voices were low, casual, punctuated by occasional laughter. The scene looked almost normal, like any group of workers wrapping up their day. Yet as Ellie stood in her kitchen, washing the glasses one by one, her mind whirled with questions. These men, rough, intimidating, yet capable of such kindness, were a mystery to her. Their world, with its own rules and codes, seemed so far removed from her quiet life. And Jack, with his gentle hands and guarded eyes, seemed to straddle both worlds, belonging fully to neither. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ellie's farmyard as she stepped onto her front porch, clutching her cotton robe around her shoulders. The rumble of motorcycles had started before dawn, and now the yard was alive with activity. Bikers moved with purpose, carrying lumber and tools, their leather vests catching the early light. Ellie watched them work, still trying to make sense of it all. The transformation of her property was remarkable. New fence posts stood straight and strong. The barn's roof gleamed with fresh repairs, and the garden beds were cleared of weeds. She couldn't help but notice how organized they were, working together like a well-oiled machine. "Would anyone like some breakfast?" she called out, her voice carrying across the yard. "I make a mean stack of pancakes." The bikers barely looked up, giving only slight head shakes as they continued their tasks. Their focus was unwavering, almost military in its precision. Only Jack paused, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, climbing the porch steps. Ellie gestured to the old wooden rocker beside her own chair. "Coffee's fresh," she said, pouring him a cup from the thermos she'd brought out. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the others work. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and fresh-cut wood. "I wasn't always like this," Jack finally said, his voice low and gravelly. He stared into his coffee cup as if it held answers. "The Hells Angels, they were my family once. Did everything with them, for them." Ellie listened, her hands wrapped around her own warm cup. She noticed the way his shoulders tensed as he spoke, how his knuckles whitened around the mug. "What changed?" she asked softly. Jack took a long breath. "Got shot during a club dispute. Nearly died. Lying there in the hospital, I realized I didn't want that life anymore." He touched his side unconsciously. It was like waking up from a long nightmare. Ellie watched his face, seeing past the tough exterior to something vulnerable beneath. The morning light softened his features, making him look younger somehow, more open. "But they're still here," she observed, nodding toward the workers in her yard. "Yeah," Jack agreed. "That's complicated. When you're in for life. But Grizzly, he understood when I needed to step back. Still, they consider me family. That's why they're here now." Ellie considered his words carefully. The man beside her wasn't the same intimidating figure she'd met on the dark highway. Here, in the morning light, she saw someone trying to change, trying to be better. It stirred something in her, not pity, but understanding, maybe even hope. As the sun climbed higher, they finished their coffee in companionable silence. The sound of hammering and power tools filled the air, but it didn't seem as intrusive as before. Ellie found herself sneaking glances at Jack, seeing him in a new light. When evening came, the bikers packed up their tools and roared away in groups of 2 and 3. The sudden quiet felt strange after the day's activity. Ellie sat alone on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Her world had shifted in ways she never expected, and she wasn't quite sure how she felt about it all. The days melted together as Ellie's property transformed under the biker's skilled hands. Her weathered fence now stood straight and strong, the barn's roof no longer leaked, and her garden bloomed with renewed vigor. The constant rumble of motorcycles had become a familiar soundtrack to her days, almost comforting in its regularity. But something wasn't quite right. Ellie noticed it in the way the bikers carried themselves, in their hushed conversations and darting glances. The easy rhythm they'd fallen into felt different now, like the calm before a storm. That afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, she watched Vince gather a small group near their bikes. Their faces were hard, shoulders tense. Words drifted across the yard in fragments. Black, riders, and territory, and trouble brewing. Before she could make sense of it, they roared off, leaving only dust and uncertainty in their wake. Ellie's stomach knotted as she remembered stories she'd heard about the Black Riders. They were bad news, worse than the Hells Angels, people said. The thought made her hands shake as she carried empty lemonade glasses back to her kitchen. "Need help with those?" Jack's voice startled her. He stood in the doorway, his leather vest covered in sawdust from working on her barn. "I thought everyone had left," Ellie said, setting the glasses in the sink. "Not yet." Jack hesitated, then gestured toward her old motorcycle, parked under the oak tree. "I noticed you've got that Honda gathering dust. Thought maybe you'd like to learn how to take care of it properly." Ellie glanced at the motorcycle. It had been her husband's, and she'd never had the heart to sell it. "I wouldn't know where to start," she admitted. "That's why I'm offering to teach you." Jack's smile was gentle, surprising on such a weathered face. "Everyone should know how to maintain their own ride." Something in his voice made her pause. Maybe it was the warmth there, or the way he looked at her, like she was capable of anything. "Well," she said slowly, "I suppose it couldn't hurt to learn." They spent the next hour beside the motorcycle, Jack patiently explaining each part and its purpose. His hands, rough from years of work, moved with surprising delicacy as he showed her how to check the oil, adjust the chain tension, and inspect the brake pads. "You're a natural," he said, as she successfully identified the spark plugs. "Reminds me of that night you helped me on the highway." Ellie felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. There was something different about Jack when it was just the two of them, a softness that seemed at odds with his tough exterior. The peaceful moment shattered as a distant rumble filled the air. It wasn't the familiar sound of the Hells Angels bikes. This was darker, more menacing. Jack's entire demeanor changed in an instant. He straightened up, his body going rigid as he stared down the road. "It's them," he muttered, his voice tight with tension. Ellie's heart began to pound as the rumble grew louder. She looked at Jack's face and saw fear there, Not for himself, she realized, but for her. The morning sun filtered through Ellie's kitchen window as she measured coffee grounds into her old percolator. The familiar routine felt oddly comforting after days of chaos. She hummed softly, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy despite the rumble of motorcycles that had become the soundtrack to her life. The peaceful moment shattered as a thunderous crash exploded from her front yard. Coffee grounds scattered across the counter as Ellie rushed to the door, her heart pounding. The scene that greeted her made her blood run cold. Dozens of motorcycles lay scattered across her yard, their chrome gleaming in the morning light. Two groups of men faced each other, their leather jackets marking clear battle lines. The Hells Angels stood their ground near her porch, while another group, the Black Riders, had formed a menacing semicircle around them. "This is our territory now," a Black Rider shouted, his face twisted with rage. "You and your pet widow don't belong here." Grizzly stepped forward, his massive frame tensed for action. "You're making a big mistake," he growled, his scarred face dark with fury. The tension snapped like a rubber band. Fists flew, bodies collided, and the sound of flesh hitting flesh filled the air. Jack moved like lightning, taking down two Black Riders before a third caught him with a wild swing. Blood sprayed from his lip, but he didn't slow down. Ellie watched in horror as her peaceful sanctuary transformed into a battlefield. These weren't the same men who had fixed her roof and mended her fences. These were warriors, dangerous and primal, fighting with a savagery that made her stomach turn. "Stop this!" Ellie stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This is my property." Jack's head snapped toward her. He abandoned his opponent and rushed to her side, his face streaked with blood. "Get inside, Ellie! It's not safe out here!" "No!" She planted her feet firmly, refusing to budge. "I want answers, Jack. Why are they really here? What's this really about?" Before Jack could respond, the wail of police sirens pierced the morning air. Red and blue lights flashed at the end of her driveway as the sheriff's cruiser appeared. The effect was immediate. The Black Riders scattered like cockroaches, engines roaring to life as they fled. Within moments, only the Hells Angels remained, straightening their clothes and wiping blood from their faces. The sudden silence felt deafening. Ellie stood in the midst of the carnage, overturned bikes, patches of disturbed earth, and spots of blood staining her grass. Her peaceful world had been turned upside down in the span of minutes. Jack approached her slowly, dabbing at his split lip with the back of his hand. His eyes were gentle despite the violence they'd just witnessed. "Everything's going to be okay, Ellie. I promise." She looked at him, really looked at him, at the bruises forming on his face, at the way he held himself like a man carrying a heavy burden. The morning sun highlighted every scar, every mark of his troubled past. Ellie felt her heart ache, but not from fear. She ached for the man before her, for the life he'd lived, and for the peace he so desperately sought. The evening settled around them like a heavy blanket. Ellie sat on her worn porch swing, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Next to her, Jack perched on the wooden railing, his normally confident posture now slumped and weary. The bruise on his cheek had darkened to an angry purple, a stark reminder of the afternoon's violence. Neither of them spoke for a long while. The crickets chirped in the growing darkness, and a cool breeze rustled through the trees. Ellie watched as Jack rubbed his hands together, his knuckles raw and red from the fight. "I need to tell you something," Jack finally said, his voice rough with emotion. He shifted his weight, turning to face her fully. "About why they're really here." Ellie set her mug down on the small table beside her, giving him her full attention. The porch light cast shadows across his face, making him look older, more vulnerable. "I was with them for 15 years, he began, gesturing vaguely toward the road where the Hells Angels had departed hours earlier. "Started young, thought I knew everything. The gang became my family when I had nothing else." He stood up and paced the length of the porch, his boots making hollow sounds against the wooden boards. 3 years ago, there was an ambush. The Black Riders caught Grizzly alone, outnumbered him 6-1. I happened to be nearby, heard the commotion. Jack paused, his hands gripping the porch railing until his knuckles turned white. I got him out, but I took 2 bullets in the process. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She could see it now, the slight stiffness in his movements that she'd noticed before but hadn't understood. That night changed everything. Jack continued. Lying in that hospital bed, I realized I couldn't do it anymore. The violence, the constant looking over my shoulder. I wanted out. His voice cracked slightly. Grizzly gave me his blessing. Said he owed me that much. But the thing about motorcycle gangs, you never really leave. They're still my brothers, even if I'm not riding with them anymore. He turned back to face Ellie, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and resignation. When they heard you helped me on that road, they saw it as a chance to repay their debt to me. All this work they're doing? He gestured at the newly repaired fence and barn. It's not just for you. It's for me. They're trying to give me something I never thought I could have, a chance at a normal life. Ellie sat perfectly still, processing his words. Everything was starting to make sense. The gang's persistence, their protectiveness, the underlying tension. But I never wanted to bring this chaos into your life, Jack said softly. What happened today with the Black Riders? That's my world, not yours. You don't deserve to be caught in the middle of it. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every movement. I should just go before things get worse. Ellie's heart thumped painfully in her chest. She looked at this man before her, not the tough biker she'd first met on the road, but someone fighting for a second chance. Someone who'd shown her nothing but respect and kindness despite his troubled past. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ellie's yard as she stood at her kitchen window, clutching her coffee mug tight. The familiar rumble of motorcycles filled the air. But today, it made her shoulders tense. Her eyes followed the movements of the Hells Angels as they worked on her property, their leather vests gleaming in the sunlight. Jack was among them, helping to repair the fence that had been damaged in yesterday's fight. The bruise on his cheek had darkened overnight, a stark reminder of the violence that had erupted in her usually peaceful yard. Ellie's hands trembled slightly as she set down her mug. Things aren't the same anymore, she whispered to herself, watching as more bikes pulled into her driveway. Vince Grizzly, Tanner's massive form, emerged from the group, his presence commanding attention as always. He carried something in his hands, a small wooden box with intricate carvings. Ellie's stomach tightened as he approached her porch. "Miss Miller," he called out, his gravelly voice carrying across the yard. "Got something for you." Ellie stepped onto the porch, maintaining a careful distance. Her eyes darted between Vince and the other bikers, noting how they had all stopped working to watch the exchange. "It's a thank you," Vince said, holding out the box. "Hand-carved by one of our own." Ellie accepted it with trembling fingers, barely managing a weak smile. That's very kind." The box was beautiful, but all she could think about was the sound of fists hitting flesh, the angry shouts from yesterday's fight, the threatening looks from the Black Riders as they'd retreated. Jack approached them, wiping his hands on a rag. He must have noticed her discomfort because his expression softened with concern. "Everything okay, Ellie?" She couldn't hold it in anymore. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "What happens when they come back?" Her voice cracked slightly. "The Black Riders, they know where I live now. They've seen." She gestured helplessly at her property, at all the improvements the Hells Angels had made. "They've seen all of this." The yard fell silent. Even the birds seemed to pause their morning songs. "Nobody's gonna touch you," Jack said firmly, stepping closer. "We won't let that happen. Right, Grizzly?" Vince nodded solemnly. You're under our protection now, Miss Miller. Ain't nobody gonna dare. Protection? Ellie interrupted, her voice stronger now. Is that what yesterday was? Because from where I was standing, it looked like chaos. Pure chaos. She set the wooden box down on her porch railing. I've lived here for 30 years. Never needed protection before. Jack moved to speak, but Ellie held up her hand. I appreciate everything you've all done for my property, but I'm not sure I can live like this. Jumping at every motorcycle sound, wondering if the next group that shows up will be friendly or... She couldn't finish the sentence. We can post guards, Jack suggested, his eyes pleading. Keep someone here round the clock. That's exactly what I'm talking about, Ellie said, wrapping her arms around herself. Guards. Round the clock. Watches? This isn't a military operation, Jack. This is my home. My life. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Vince exchanged glances with Jack, while the other bikers shifted uncomfortably in the background. Ellie stood her ground, though her heart was racing. She had a decision to make, and for the first time since this all began, she wasn't sure what choice would keep her safe. Ellie sat on her front porch steps, watching the sun sink behind the distant hills. The day's warmth was fading, replaced by a cool evening breeze that rustled through the trees. Her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Jack stood a few feet away, his broad shoulders tense as he leaned against the porch railing. The fading light cast long shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the fresh bruises from the earlier fight. His leather jacket creaked softly as he shifted his weight. I know it's a lot to take in, he said, his voice rough but gentle. These guys, they're not just a gang to me. They're family, but I understand if it's too much. Ellie took a slow breath, studying the man before her. In the short time she'd known him, she'd seen glimpses of who he really was beneath the tough exterior, someone kind, someone searching for peace. But the violence from earlier still echoed in her mind. She started, then paused to gather her thoughts. I've lived a quiet life. Jack, what happened today? That kind of violence, it scares me. Jack pushed away from the railing and carefully sat down beside her, leaving enough space between them to respect her boundaries. The wood creaked under his weight. I won't let anything happen to you, he said firmly. The club, they'll protect this place. Protect you. Ellie set her cup down on the step. That's exactly what worries me. I don't want to need protection. I don't want to live looking over my shoulder, wondering when the next fight will break out in my front yard. A motorcycle roared in the distance, and Ellie flinched involuntarily. Jack noticed, his face falling slightly. I get it, he said softly. This life, it follows you. Even when you try to leave it behind. He rubbed his hands together, a nervous gesture that seemed out of place on such a tough-looking man. When I left the club, I thought I could just walk away. But it's not that simple. These bonds, they run deep. Ellie turned to look at him directly. And the Black Riders? Will they come back? Jack's jaw tightened. Probably. But we'll handle it. You won't have to. That's just it, Ellie interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. I don't want anything to be handled. This is my home, Jack, my peaceful little corner of the world. And now it feels like I'm living in the middle of a war zone. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. In the growing darkness, the crickets began their evening chorus, a reminder of the simple peace that had existed here just days ago. Jack stood slowly, his boots scuffing against the wooden boards. He looked down at Ellie, his eyes full of understanding and regret. I never meant to bring this chaos into your life. You showed me kindness that night on the road. Real kindness, with no strings attached. That's rare in my world. He took a deep breath, shoving his hands into his pockets. If you want me to go, to tell the club to leave you alone, I will. You deserve your peace. But even as he made the offer, they both knew it wasn't that simple anymore. The quiet life Ellie had known was already changed, transformed by the rumble of motorcycles and the weight of Jack's past. Ellie closed her eyes, feeling the evening breeze on her face. When she opened them again, Jack was still there, waiting patiently, a man caught between two worlds, the violence of his past and the possibility of something different, something better. The evening sun cast long shadows across Ellie's porch as she sat, in her favorite rocking chair, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of cooling tea. Jack stood at the railing, his broad shoulders tense as he stared out at the horizon. The silence between them felt heavy, filled with unspoken fears and doubts. "I need to know something, Jack," Ellie said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "Are you staying because you want to, or because you feel obligated?" Jack turned to face her, his weathered features softening. "I'm here because I want to be, Ellie. These past few weeks—" He paused, running a hand through his graying hair. "They've meant more to me than you know." Ellie studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. The man before her wasn't the same intimidating figure who'd broken down on her road that first night. She'd seen glimpses of his gentler side, the way he carefully tended to her garden, how he spoke softly to her old cat, the genuine smile that would sometimes break through his tough exterior. "But what about the gang?" she pressed. "What about the violence that follows them? Follows you?" Jack moved closer, settling into the chair beside her. "I can't erase my past, Ellie, but I'm not that person anymore. The angels." He sighed heavily. "They're part of who I was, but they don't control who I am now." "You say that, but I saw the fight," Ellie countered, setting her tea aside. "I saw how quickly everything can turn dangerous. How am I supposed to feel safe?" "I would never let anything happen to you," Jack said firmly, his eyes meeting hers. "I promise you that. Whatever comes, whatever threats appear, I'll handle them. You won't have to face any of it alone." Ellie's heart tightened at his words. She wanted to believe him, desperately wanted to trust in the sincerity she heard in his voice. But the memory of the black riders in her yard, the violence that had erupted so suddenly, still haunted her. "Promises are easy to make, Jack," she said softly. "But keeping them? That's different." Jack reached out, hesitating before gently taking her hand in his. His calloused fingers were warm against her skin. "I know I haven't given you much reason to trust me. My life, it's been full of mistakes and regrets. But meeting you," he squeezed her hand gently, "that wasn't one of them." Ellie looked down at their joined hands, feeling the strength in his grip and the tremor of emotion in his touch. She thought about the lonely years after her husband's death, how she'd built walls around her heart, convinced she'd never let anyone close again. Now here was Jack, somehow having found a way past those defenses. "I want to believe you," she whispered, her voice catching. "I want to trust that you mean what you say." "Then let me prove it to you," Jack replied, his eyes earnest. "Day by day. I'm not asking you to forget everything that's happened or to ignore the risks. I'm just asking for a chance to show you who I really am, who I want to be." Ellie felt tears pricking at her eyes. She blinked them away, trying to hold on to her resolve. Part of her wanted to embrace this promise of companionship, of having someone to share her life with again. But another part remembered the chaos that had invaded her peaceful existence, the danger that seemed to lurk around every corner since the angels had arrived. Looking into Jack's eyes, she saw his sincerity, his hope, and his fear that she would push him away. The realization that he was just as vulnerable as she was struck her deeply. "I want to trust you, Jack," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm scared. I'm scared of what might happen, of losing everything I've built here, of losing you." A heavy silence hung over Ellie's property that morning. The usual rumble of motorcycles was replaced by the soft sounds of work, hammers tapping, saws cutting, and the occasional murmur of conversation. The bikers moved with purpose, but their usual boisterous energy was gone. Ellie stood at her kitchen window, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. She watched as three burly men carefully repaired her barn's weathered siding. Their movements were precise, almost gentle. These weren't the violent troublemakers she'd imagined when they first roared onto her property. Near the fence line, a woman with silver-streaked hair was teaching two younger members how to properly set fence posts. Her patience reminded Ellie of her late husband, Thomas, who always said that doing things right was more important than doing them quickly. "They're good workers, aren't they?" Jack's voice startled her from behind. Ellie turned, composing herself. "They are. I never would have expected that we'd know our way around a hammer and saw." Jack smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. The bruise from yesterday's fight was turning purple along his jaw. "The barn hasn't looked this good in years," Ellie admitted, gesturing to where the fresh wood gleamed in the morning sun. "And the garden." She trailed off, remembering how carefully they'd worked around her prized roses, treating the delicate plants with unexpected reverence. Jack leaned against the counter, his leather vest creaking. "Most of us came from regular lives before the club. Mike out there used to be a carpenter. Sarah, the one teaching the youngsters, she ran her own construction company." Ellie nodded, watching as another group started painting her storage shed. Their work was methodical, thorough. These weren't rush jobs or half measures, they were putting real care into every task. "I appreciate everything they're doing," she said softly. "But Jack," she set down her coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly. "Yesterday, when those other bikers came—" "I know." Jack's voice was quiet. "You didn't sign up for any of this." Outside, Vince was directing a team moving lumber for the new chicken coop they'd insisted on building. His massive frame bent down to help a younger member adjust his grip on a heavy beam, showing him the proper technique. "They're not just here because they owe you, are they?" Ellie asked, watching the scene unfold. Jack shook his head slowly. "No. They're here because they believe in loyalty, in protecting their own." He paused, looking at her intently. "And because you showed kindness to one of us without asking anything in return." Ellie's chest tightened. The work they were doing was transforming her property, breathing new life into the aging farm she'd struggled to maintain alone. But with every improvement came the weight of knowing it wasn't just about fixing things, it was about marking territory, about making a statement. She watched as Sarah praised the younger members for their fence work, their proud grins visible even from the kitchen window. These people, with their leather and tattoos, their rough exteriors and gentle hands, had brought both hope and fear into her quiet life. "I want to trust this," she whispered, more to herself than to Jack. "I want to believe that good can come from all of this." Outside, the work continued under the autumn sun. The property was coming alive again, piece by piece. But Ellie's heart remained heavy with uncertainty about what tomorrow might bring. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ellie's property as she watched the Hells Angels work. The steady rhythm of hammers and power tools filled the air, but it couldn't drown out her growing unease. Three bikers were fixing her porch steps, while others patched the roof of her old barn. Jack worked alongside them, his movements careful and deliberate as he replaced rotted wood. Every so often, he'd glance her way, offering a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Ellie noticed how he kept scanning the road, his shoulders tense. Inside her kitchen, Ellie's hands trembled as she poured coffee into mismatched mugs. Through the window, she could see Vince talking in hushed tones with two other bikers, their faces grim. One of them pointed down the road, and Vince's expression darkened. "Need help with those?" Jack's voice made her jump, nearly spilling the coffee. Oh, I didn't hear you come in. Ellie steadied herself against the counter. I'm fine, just making coffee for everyone. Jack moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. I saw some black riders circling the area this morning. They're getting bolder. Ellie's stomach clenched. What do they want? Territory. Respect. Jack ran a hand through his hair. And they're not happy about us being here. A motorcycle roared past the house, the sound making Ellie flinch. Jack immediately moved to the window, his body tense like a coiled spring. Just a regular rider, he said, but his relief was short-lived. Outside, Vince barked orders to his men. Two bikers mounted their motorcycles and sped off in opposite directions. The others gathered their tools closer, their easy camaraderie replaced by watchful alertness. Ellie's hands shook as she set down the coffee pot. I never meant for any of this to happen. I just wanted to help someone in need that night. You did help, Jack said softly. More than you know. A distant rumble of motorcycles echoed through the valley. This time, it wasn't just one bike. The sound grew louder, more threatening. Vince burst through the kitchen door. Jack, we've got company. Get Ellie somewhere safe. Ellie's heart pounded as Jack guided her toward the basement door. Wait, she protested. This is my home. I can't just hide, please. Jack's eyes were pleading. These aren't people you can reason with. They're not here to talk. The sound of motorcycles grew deafening. Through the window, Ellie caught glimpses of black leather and chrome as riders appeared on the road. The black riders had returned in force. I never thought it would come to this, Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible over the approaching thunder of engines. My home. It used to be so peaceful. Jack's face was etched with guilt. I'm sorry, Ellie. I never meant to bring this chaos into your life. Outside, Vince and his men formed a protective line across her property. The tension in the air was electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. Ellie could see weapons being readied. Chains, brass knuckles, things she'd only seen in movies. The peaceful autumn afternoon had transformed into something dangerous and unpredictable. Her sanctuary, the home she'd shared with her late husband, now felt like a battleground. As Jack led her to the basement, Ellie's fear wasn't just for herself anymore. She worried about Jack, about the men who'd worked so hard to help her, and about what would be left of her home when this was over. The sound of engines filled her ears, and she could feel violence hanging in the air like a storm about to break. The rumble of motorcycles shattered the early morning peace. Ellie stood at her kitchen window, coffee cup trembling in her hand as she watched the foremost. Black riders pour onto her property. There were more of them this time, much more. Their black leather cuts and chrome bikes gleamed menacingly in the morning sun. Jack burst through her screen door, his face tight with worry. Stay inside, Ellie. Please. This is my home, she said, setting down her cup. I won't hide. Before Jack could argue, Vince and the other Hells Angels roared up the driveway, their bikes forming a protective wall between Ellie's house and the rival gang. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The leader of the Black Riders, a tall man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, stepped forward. You're harboring a traitor, he shouted, pointing at Jack. He needs to answer for what he did. Ellie's heart pounded. She looked at Jack, whose jaw was clenched tight. Whatever he'd done in his past, it was coming back to haunt him, and now her too. Nobody's answering for anything, Vince growled, his massive frame blocking the rival leader's path. This property is under our protection. The confrontation escalated quickly. Harsh words turned to shoving, and soon the first punch was thrown. Ellie watched in horror as her peaceful sanctuary erupted into chaos. Fists flew, bodies crashed into her garden fence, and the sound of breaking glass pierced the air. In the midst of it all, Jack stayed close to her. his presence both reassuring and troubling. He'd brought this violence to her doorstep, yet she couldn't help feeling safer with him near. The contradiction tied her stomach in knots. Jack said softly, his eyes never leaving the brawl. I never meant for any of this to touch you. Ellie watched as one of her flower pots shattered, scattering dirt and petunias across the lawn. These were the flowers she'd planted after her husband passed away. Now they were casualties in a war she never asked to join. I know you didn't, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But it has. The fighting continued, brutal and raw. Ellie saw both sides taking hits, blood-staining shirts and knuckles. This wasn't like the movies. It was ugly, desperate, and frightening. Yet she couldn't look away. Her feelings for Jack had grown over the past days. She'd seen his gentleness when he helped fix her roof, his patience when teaching her about motorcycles, his quiet strength when he spoke about wanting to change. But now, watching violence unfold on her property, she felt her heart being pulled in opposite directions. Jack, she said, grabbing his arm, make it stop. Please. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the pain in his eyes. He was caught between two worlds, the violent past he was trying to leave behind, and the peaceful future he wanted to build. Just like she was caught between her fear of this chaos and her growing feelings for him. The sound of police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The Black Riders began to scatter, mounting their bikes and peeling away from her property. The Hells Angels stood their ground, bloodied but unbowed. Ellie remained on her porch, her hand still on Jack's arm. She didn't know what to say or do. Her head told her to run, to ask them all to leave and never come back. But her heart, her traitorous heart, wanted to understand, to help, to believe that something good could come from all this mess. She looked up at Jack, seeing both the man he was and the man he wanted to be. The choice before her seemed impossible. Embrace the danger that came with him, or push away the connection they'd built. The sirens grew closer, and Ellie felt tears prick at her eyes, torn between what was safe and what her heart wanted. The evening sun cast long shadows across Ellie's front yard as she sat on her porch steps, watching Jack pace back and forth. His knuckles were bruised from the earlier fight with the Black Riders, and worry lines creased his forehead. The peaceful chirping of crickets seemed out of place after such a violent day. I shouldn't have brought this to your doorstep, Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. He stopped pacing and leaned against the porch railing, running a hand through his graying hair. You don't deserve any of this, Ellie. Ellie wrapped her sweater tighter around herself. Why did you leave the gang, Jack? Really? Jack's shoulders tensed. He looked out at the setting sun, his eyes distant. 3 years ago, I was in a bad fight, the kind that leaves you wondering if you'll make it through the night. He touched a scar on his neck that Ellie hadn't noticed before. I laid there in the hospital for weeks, thinking about all the choices I'd made. What happened then? Ellie asked softly. I tried to walk away. Jack's laugh was bitter. But walking away isn't as simple as just saying goodbye. These guys, he gestured toward the road where the other bikers had left. They're like family, the kind that sticks with you whether you want them to or not. Ellie stood up and moved closer to him. But you did leave. I thought I did. Jack turned to face her, his eyes filled with pain. Truth is, Ellie, I'm still caught in their web. Every time I think I'm free, something pulls me back in. The debt they say they owe me, that's just their way of keeping me close. Can't you just tell them to leave you alone? Jack shook his head slowly. It's not that simple. These bonds, they're like chains. Even when you break them, the marks stay with you. He looked down at his tattoo-covered arms, touching the faded ink. I've tried to start over, to be someone different. But that life, it's in my blood now. Ellie watched as Jack's tough exterior crumbled slightly, revealing the weight he carried. His hands trembled as he gripped the railing tighter. "You know what's worse?" he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Part of me still wants it. The brotherhood, the rush, the feeling of belonging somewhere. It's like a drug I can't quit, completely." He turned to look at her, his eyes filled with shame. "I'm not the good man you think I am, Ellie. I'm just trapped between two worlds." The confession hung heavy in the air between them. Ellie could see the struggle written across Jack's face, the pull between the man he wanted to be and the life that wouldn't let him go. The gang's shadow loomed over him like a dark cloud, even here in the peaceful sanctuary of her farm. "Every time I try to make a clean break," Jack said, "something happens. Someone needs help, or there's a score to settle, or," he gestured at her property, "someone shows kindness to the wrong person at the wrong time. And just like that, I'm pulled back in." Jack's admission settled over them like a heavy blanket. The truth of his situation finally laid bare. The man who had seemed so strong and certain now stood before her, vulnerable and caught in a web of his own past. "The gang still has its hooks in me, Ellie," he admitted quietly, "and I don't know if I'll ever be truly free." The evening sun cast long shadows across Ellie's porch as she sat with Jack, both of them nursing cups of coffee that had long since gone cold. The bruises on Jack's face from the earlier fight were starting to darken, and Ellie couldn't help but notice how he winced whenever he moved. "You never really answered my question," Ellie said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "About the Hells Angels, about why you're still tied to them even though you left." Jack shifted in his chair, his leather jacket creaking. He set his coffee down and rubbed his face with both hands, careful to avoid the bruised areas. "It's complicated, Ellie. When you're in the gang, it becomes your family. Even when you try to leave, those bonds, they don't just disappear." "But you did leave," Ellie pressed gently. "You told me you wanted out of that life." "I did. I do." Jack's voice was rough with emotion. He stood up and walked to the porch railing, gripping it tight. "But leaving isn't as simple as just walking away. The things I've seen, the things I've done." He trailed off, staring into the distance where the sun was setting behind the hills. Ellie watched him, seeing the weight of his past pressing down on his broad shoulders. "Jack, what aren't you telling me?" He turned to face her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw real fear in his eyes. "I want out. For good, this time. No more favors. No more ties. No more violence." He ran a hand through his graying hair. "But the last guy who tried to leave completely? They found him 3 states over. He wasn't." Jack swallowed hard. He didn't make it. The silence that followed was heavy. Ellie's heart pounded as she processed his words. "Even Grizzly, with all his talk about brotherhood and loyalty," Jack continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "he's got rules. Breaking away completely? That's seen as the ultimate betrayal. And betrayal has consequences. But they seem to respect you," Ellie said, standing up to join him at the railing. "They've been here helping because of you." Jack laughed, but there was no humor in it. "They respect what I did for them in the past. But that respect?" He shook his head. "It won't mean anything if I try to cut ties completely. They'll see it as choosing another life over the brotherhood, and that's something they can't accept." "So, what are you going to do?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jack turned to her, his eyes intense. "I'm tired, Ellie. Tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of being pulled back into their world. Being here, with you." He paused, struggling with his words. "It's shown me what life could be like. Real life, not just surviving from one day to the next." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. From inside, he extracted a worn patch, the Hells Angels insignia. I've carried this as a reminder of who I was. But now? He stared at it, his fingers running over the familiar embroidery. Now it feels like a chain around my neck. They won't let you go easily, Ellie said, stating what they both knew. No, Jack agreed, his voice heavy with resignation. They won't. And that's what scares me, Ellie. Not dying. I've faced that before. But the thought that they might come after anyone I care about. He looked at her meaningfully. Anyone who means something to me. The last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the hills, leaving them in the growing darkness. The sound of distant motorcycles echoed through the valley, making them both tense. Jack's hand instinctively moved to shield Ellie, even though the sound was far away. The evening sun cast long shadows across Ellie's porch as she sat in her old rocking chair, watching Jack tinker with his motorcycle. His hands moved with practiced ease over the engine, but his shoulders were tense, betraying the weight of everything unsaid between them. You know, Ellie began, her voice gentle but firm. Sometimes the hardest part isn't leaving something behind, it's believing you deserve better. Jack's hands stilled on the wrench. He didn't look up, but she could see him processing her words. The wind rustled through the autumn leaves, filling the silence between them. I've done things, Ellie, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Things I can't take back. Ellie stood up from her chair and walked down the porch steps. Her movements were slow but deliberate as she approached him. We've all got regrets, Jack. The question is, what do we do with them? He finally looked up at her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that made him seem younger somehow. The gang, they're the only family I've known for 20 years. Even now, trying to leave. He shook his head. It feels like I'm cutting off my own arm. Family doesn't hold you hostage, Ellie said, placing a weathered hand on his shoulder. Real family helps you grow, even if that means watching you leave. Jack set down his wrench and leaned against the motorcycle. The Black Riders won't stop coming. And the Angels, they mean well. But their help comes with strings. Always has. Ellie nodded, understanding flooding her features. I'm scared too, Jack. Every time I hear motorcycles now, my heart jumps. But you know what scares me more? She waited until he met her eyes. The thought of letting fear stop us from doing what's right. Us? Jack's voice cracked slightly on the word. Yes, us. Ellie's voice was steady. You're not alone in this anymore. Whether you choose to stay or go, I'll be here. But you have to choose for yourself. Not for them. Not for me. Jack stood up, pacing a few steps. I don't know how to be anyone else, he admitted. Thunder, that's who I've been for so long. Without that, you're Jack Thompson, Ellie said firmly. A man who helps fix my garden fence, who drinks tea on my porch, who makes me laugh with terrible jokes. That's who you are without the leather and the name. Tears welled in Jack's eyes, though he quickly blinked them away. He reached for Ellie's hand, holding it like it was something precious. I'm terrified, he whispered. So am I, Ellie admitted, squeezing his hand. But maybe that's okay. Maybe being scared just means we're finally doing something worth fighting for. They stood there together as the sun continued its descent, casting everything in soft golden light. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring, whether the Black Riders would return, whether the Angels would understand, whether they could build something new from the ashes of the old. But in that moment, sharing their fears under the fading sky, they weren't alone. And sometimes, Ellie thought, that was enough to start with. The evening sun cast long shadows across Ellie's porch as she sat in her favorite rocking chair, watching Jack pace back and forth. His leather jacket was off, revealing a plain white t-shirt that showed his tattoos. His face was troubled, deep lines creasing his forehead. You know they won't let this go, Ellie said softly. The Black Riders, they'll keep coming back. Jack stopped pacing and leaned against the porch railing. I know. His voice was rough with emotion. That's why I need to handle this. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. What does that mean, Jack? Grizzly came by earlier. He offered me a deal. Jack ran a hand through his graying hair. Said if I come back to the Angels, they'll take care of the Black Riders once and for all. Make sure they never bother us again. No. The word came out sharp and clear. Ellie stood up, her hands trembling. You can't go back to that life. It might be the only way to keep you safe. Jack's eyes met hers, filled with conflict. I brought this trouble to your door, Ellie. I owe you better than this. You don't owe me anything. Ellie moved closer to him. That night, I helped you with your bike? I did it because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted something in return. Jack's shoulders slumped. The Angels, they're not bad people. But that life, he shook his head. The violence, the constant looking over your shoulder, wondering if today's the day someone decides to prove themselves by taking you down. Then why even consider it? Ellie asked. Because I'm scared. The words burst from him. Not for me, for you. Every time I close my eyes, I see the Black Riders coming back. I see them hurting you to get to me. Ellie reached out and took his rough, calloused hand in hers. Listen to me, Jack Thompson. You've worked too hard to leave that life behind. I've watched you these past weeks. I've seen how gentle you can be, how kind. That's the real you. But, no buts. Ellie's voice was firm. If you go back to the Angels, you'll lose yourself again, and I— She squeezed his hand. I don't want to lose the man I've come to. No. Jack stared at their joined hands. The tension in his body slowly began to ease. I can't go back, he said finally. Even if I wanted to, I can't be that person anymore. Then don't. The Black Riders. We'll figure something out, Ellie said. Together, without violence. Without you having to sacrifice who you've become. Jack looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. You know, when my bike broke down that night, I thought it was the worst luck. Turns out it was the best thing that ever happened to me. A warm breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sweet scent of Ellie's garden. In the distance, they could hear the occasional rumble of motorcycles, but for now, they seemed far away. I won't go back, Jack said firmly. Whatever happens, whatever the consequences, I'm done with that life. The Angels will have to understand. Ellie smiled, relief flooding through her. Good, because that Jack Thompson, the one who helps me in the garden and fixed my roof, that's the one I want to keep around. Jack's lips twitched in a small smile, but his eyes were serious. It won't be easy. Nothing worth having ever is. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ellie's front porch as she sat in her rocking chair, watching Jack work on his motorcycle. The past few days had been quiet, too quiet. She knew in her heart that something had to change. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the arms of her chair. Jack, she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. We need to talk. Jack looked up from his work, grease smudged across his weathered face. He set down his wrench and walked over, settling on the porch steps near her feet. What's on your mind, Ellie? She took a deep breath, steadying herself. I've been thinking about everything that's happened. The fights, the rival gang. All of it. She paused, watching his expression carefully. I can't live like this anymore, Jack. And I don't think you can, either. Jack's shoulders tensed. Ellie, I told you I'd protect you. That's not what I want. She cut him off firmly. I don't want protection. I want peace. She leaned forward in her chair, her eyes meeting his. You need to leave the gang, for good this time. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush them both. Jack's face darkened with worry. It's not that simple. The Hells Angels, they're not just a gang. They're family. Family doesn't put you in danger, Ellie replied. her voice gentle but firm. Family doesn't make you live in fear. She stood up slowly, walking to the porch railing. The morning light caught the silver in her hair as she gazed out over her property. I've watched you these past weeks, Jack. When you're working on bikes, when you're helping around the farm, that's the real you, not the man who has to fight and run. Jack stood too, his hands clenched at his sides. You don't understand what leaving means. The Black Riders won't stop. The angels. They might not accept it. Ellie turned to face him, her expression determined. Then we'll face that together. But I won't watch you destroy yourself trying to live in both worlds. She took a step closer to him. You left once before. You can do it again. And what happens to you? Jack's voice cracked slightly. If I leave, if I walk away completely, they might come after both of us. Then that's a risk I'm willing to take, Ellie said firmly. But I won't stand by and watch you get pulled back into that life. Not when I know there's so much more in you. She reached out and took his rough hand in hers. You're not that man anymore, Jack. You haven't been for a long time. Stop pretending you are. Jack's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he looked down at their joined hands. Ellie. No more excuses, she said softly but firmly. No more half measures. You either leave the gang, all of it, or, she took a shaky breath, or you leave here. Those are your choices. The weight of her ultimatum hung in the air between them. Jack's hand tightened around hers, and she could feel him trembling slightly. I won't watch you die, she whispered. And that's what will happen if you stay with them. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. And I can't, her voice broke. I can't lose anyone else I care about. Jack looked at her for a long moment, his expression a mix of fear and something else. Something that looked almost like hope. The morning sun continued to rise, casting their shadows long across the porch boards, as they stood together at the crossroads of their lives. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ellie's porch as she sat in her old rocking chair, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. The events of the past few days weighed heavily on her mind. She watched as Jack worked on fixing her garden fence, his movements careful and deliberate, so different from the rough biker she'd first met on that dark highway. Her chest tightened as she thought about her conversation with Vince. His words still echoed in her ears. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Miller. The Black Riders won't stop. We're the only ones who can protect you both. But Ellie knew better. She'd seen enough violence in the past weeks to last a lifetime. The broken windows from the fight, the scattered motorcycle parts in her yard, the constant rumble of engines that made her jump at every sound. This wasn't the life she wanted. More importantly, it wasn't the life Jack needed. She set her coffee down and walked to the porch railing, gripping it tightly. Her knuckles turned white as she remembered the look in Jack's eyes when she'd told him he needed to leave the gang for good. There had been fear there, yes, but also hope. Hope for something different, something better. What if I'm wrong? She whispered to herself, watching Jack work. What if they come after him? After us? The doubt gnawed at her insides like a hungry thing. She'd lived alone for so long after her husband passed, content with her quiet life. Now here she was, standing up to a motorcycle gang, trying to help a man she barely knew find his way to a better life. Jack looked up from his work and caught her eye. He gave her that small, hesitant smile she'd grown so fond of, the one that made him look younger, more vulnerable. Her heart squeezed in her chest. Ellie straightened her shoulders. No, she wasn't wrong. The violence had to stop somewhere. Someone had to be brave enough to say enough was enough. She thought of all the times in her life when she'd taken the safe road, when she'd let fear guide her decisions. Not this time. She walked down the porch steps, her movements steady despite her racing heart. Jack set down his tools as she approached, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Ellie looked at him, really looked at him. She saw past the tattoos, past the leather jacket hanging on the fence post, past all the markers of his old life. She saw the man who could be, who wanted to be more than his past. "Yes," she said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "I know what I'm doing, Jack. It won't be easy, but nothing worth doing ever is." The tension in Jack's shoulders eased slightly. He nodded, understanding passing between them without words. Ellie touched his arm lightly. "We'll figure it out, one day at a time." She felt it then, the rightness of her decision settling into her bones like an old friend. The fear was still there, hovering at the edges of her mind, but it no longer had the power to shake her resolve. She'd chosen her path, chosen to believe in the possibility of change, in the power of second chances. The morning sun warmed her face as she stood there with Jack, both of them silent but understanding. Sometimes the hardest choices were also the simplest. You just had to be brave enough to make them. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ellie's front porch as she watched Jack pack his few belongings into a worn leather saddlebag. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as if each item carried the weight of his past decisions. The Hells Angels had left yesterday, their thundering engines fading into distant echoes, but their presence still lingered like a ghost around her property. Ellie's hands trembled slightly as she poured 2 cups of coffee. "You don't have to leave right away," she said, offering him a steaming mug. "You could stay here for a while, figure things out." Jack accepted the coffee with a grateful nod, his weathered face softening. "I appreciate that, Ellie, but I need to make a clean break. Can't have one foot in each world anymore." The morning breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves, and Ellie wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself. She studied Jack's face, noting how different he looked from the intimidating biker who'd broken down on her road just weeks ago. The hard edges were still there, but something had changed in his eyes. "What will you do?" she asked, settling into her favorite rocking chair. Jack leaned against the porch railing, his fingers drumming against the coffee mug. "Got a cousin in Montana. Owns a legitimate motorcycle repair shop. Says he could use someone who knows their way around engines." Ellie nodded, but her mind wandered to the violence she'd witnessed. The fighting, the raw anger she'd seen in Jack's eyes during those moments. "And the others? Will they really let you walk away?" Grizzly gave his word, Jack said. But Ellie caught the slight hesitation in his voice. "Besides, they owe me. That counts for something in their world." A truck rumbled past on the distant highway, and Ellie noticed how Jack's shoulders tensed at the sound, his eyes automatically scanning for danger. Old habits, she realized, wouldn't disappear overnight. "You know," she said carefully, "violence becomes a part of you after a while, like a reflex you can't control." She thought of her late husband, a Vietnam veteran who'd struggled with his own demons. It takes time to unlearn those instincts. Jack set his coffee down, his expression troubled. "I've been fighting since I was 16, Ellie. Sometimes I wonder if I know how to live any other way." He ran a hand through his graying hair. "But I have to try. I'm tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of solving everything with my fists." Ellie stood up and walked to the railing beside him. Below, his motorcycle sat ready for the journey, cleaned and maintained by his own hands. "Will you write to me?" she asked. "Let me know how you're doing." "Every week," he promised, though they both knew such promises were easier made than kept. Ellie watched a flock of birds wheel across the sky, their formation perfect and purposeful. She thought about redemption, about second chances, about the long road ahead for Jack. The violence she'd witnessed was still fresh in her mind. The way he'd moved during the fights, the cold efficiency of his actions. Those memories warred with the gentle way he'd fixed her fence, the careful attention he'd paid to her garden, the quiet conversations they'd shared on this very porch. "Just remember," she said softly, "changing who you are isn't the same as denying who you were. The man who helped me these past weeks, that's the real you too." Jack's eyes met hers, filled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. The morning light caught the silver in his hair, the lines around his eyes, the scars that told stories he'd never fully shared. Ellie saw in that moment both versions of him, the fighter he'd been and the man he wanted to become, and wondered which one would ultimately prevail. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ellie's front porch as she sat in her favorite rocking chair, a cup of steaming coffee warming her hands. The rumble of motorcycles had faded days ago, leaving behind an almost eerie silence. Jack worked in her garden, his leather jacket replaced by a plain white t-shirt that showed his tattoos, remnants of his past life. "You know," Ellie said, watching him tend to her tomato plants with surprising gentleness, "I never thought I'd find peace in all this chaos." Jack straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Neither did I. Keep expecting to hear bikes coming down that road." A car passed by, making them both tense. It was just Mrs. Henderson from the church, waving as she drove past. They'd been jumpy like this for days now, every unfamiliar sound making them freeze. "Come sit with me." Ellie patted the chair beside her. "The tomatoes can wait." Jack walked up the creaky steps and settled into the chair, his large frame somehow looking smaller in the morning light. "I see them sometimes," he admitted quietly, "in my dreams. The fights, the raids, all of it." Ellie reached over and placed her hand on his arm. His skin was warm from working in the sun. "Those memories don't just disappear overnight." "No, they don't." Jack's voice was rough with emotion. "Last night, I dreamed about the night we met. Except in the dream, when the Black Riders showed up, I couldn't protect you. I woke up in a cold sweat." "But you did protect me," Ellie reminded him. "And I protected you too, in my own way." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the morning traffic pass by. A motorcycle roared in the distance, and Jack's hand tightened on the armrest. Ellie noticed but didn't comment. "Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice," Jack said suddenly. "Not about leaving, I know that was right, but about staying here, putting you at risk." Ellie set down her coffee cup with a decisive clink. "Now, you listen to me, Jack Thompson. I'm not some fragile flower that needs protecting. I made my choice too, remember? I chose to help a stranger on a dark road, and I chose to stand by him when things got rough." Jack's weather-worn face softened. "You're the strongest person I know, Ellie. But the things I've done are in the past," she finished firmly. "We all have ghosts, Jack. Mine might not wear leather jackets, but they're there. My Herbert's been gone 5 years now, but sometimes I still set 2 places at the table." A bird landed on the porch railing, pecking at some seeds that had fallen there. They watched it hop around, completely unafraid. "You know what Herbert used to say?" Ellie continued, her voice gentle. "He'd say, 'The past is like a shadow. It follows you everywhere, but it can't hurt you unless you let it.'" Jack nodded slowly, understanding settling in his eyes. "Smart man." "He was," Ellie agreed. "And he would have liked you. Believe it or not, he always had a soft spot for people trying to change their lives." The morning continued to unfold around them. Birds singing, neighbors going about their business, the distant sound of a lawnmower. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, each one helped to push back against the memories that tried to haunt them. "We'll be okay," Ellie said, more of a statement than a question. Jack reached over and squeezed her hand. "Yeah," he said, his voice stronger now. "We will be." They sat together on the porch, 2 unlikely friends bound by circumstance and choice, facing their ghosts in the morning light. The past might still lurk in the shadows, But they weren't facing it alone anymore. The autumn sun cast long shadows across Ellie's property as she stood on her front porch, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke from nearby farms. It had been 3 days since the last of the Hells Angels had rumbled away on their motorcycles, leaving behind an almost unsettling quiet. Jack emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on an old rag. He'd spent the morning tinkering with her tractor, determined to keep himself busy. His leather jacket was gone now, replaced by a simple flannel shirt and worn jeans. The change in his appearance matched the transformation in his eyes, softer now, though still carrying the weight of his past. "Got that old engine purring again," he called out, crossing the yard toward her. His boots crunched on the gravel driveway, the sound echoing in the peaceful morning. Ellie smiled, appreciating how naturally he seemed to fit into this simpler life. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, already turning to head inside. "That'd be nice," Jack replied, following her into the kitchen. The room was warm and filled with morning light. It felt different now, less lonely, more alive with possibility. As Ellie poured him a cup, her hands trembled slightly. The quiet moments like these still felt fragile, as if they might shatter at any moment. "Do you miss them?" she asked, unable to keep the question inside any longer. Jack took the coffee, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," he admitted, leaning against the counter. "Not the violence or the chaos, but the brotherhood. They were my family for a long time. And now?" Ellie's voice was gentle, free of judgment. "Now I'm learning what real peace feels like," he said, meeting her eyes. "It's different. Harder in some ways, easier in others." They moved back to the porch, settling into the old wooden chairs that had witnessed so much change over the past weeks. The property stretched out before them. The repaired fence, the freshly painted barn, the garden now cleared for winter. Each improvement marked a chapter in their unlikely story. "I keep expecting to hear motorcycles," Ellie confessed, her fingers tightening around her cup. "Or see the Black Riders coming back." Jack nodded, understanding her fear. "That life is behind us now," he said firmly. "I made my choice, and I don't regret it." The morning breeze rustled through the remaining leaves on the old maple tree, sending a shower of gold and red drifting across the yard. A reminder that everything changes, that nothing stays the same forever. "We can't know what's coming," Ellie said, voicing the thought that had been weighing on both their minds. "But I suppose nobody really does." Jack reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "No, we can't," he agreed, "but we can face it together." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. The day ahead was full of ordinary tasks: fixing things, tending to the property, preparing for winter. Simple things that felt extraordinary after everything they'd been through. A flock of geese passed overhead, their calls carrying across the clear sky. Ellie and Jack watched them go, two people from different worlds who had somehow found common ground in this quiet corner of the world. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, they had this moment. This peace they'd fought so hard to find. The morning stretched out before them, full of possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. But they would face it together, one day at a time. The rumble of motorcycles echoed through the valley, sending a familiar chill down Ellie's spine. She stood on her front porch, her hands gripping the wooden railing. Next to her, Jack tensed, his weathered face hardening as 3 bikes approached her property. "It's the Black Riders," he muttered, stepping forward protectively. "Stay inside, Ellie." But Ellie didn't move. Instead, she placed a gentle hand on Jack's arm. "No," she said firmly. "We're not doing this anymore. No more running, no more fighting." The motorcycles pulled up to her fence, their engines cutting off with a final growl. 3 men dismounted, their leather jackets bearing the distinctive patches of the Black Riders. The leader, a tall man with a silver-streaked beard, stepped forward. "Thompson," he called out. "Word is you've gone soft." Jack's muscles tensed under Ellie's touch, but she squeezed his arm gently. "Let me handle this," she whispered. To everyone's surprise, Ellie walked down the porch steps. Her movements were calm and deliberate as she approached the fence. The bikers watched her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I know why you're here. You want to prove something. But there's nothing left to prove. Jack's not part of that world anymore." The leader scoffed. "Lady, you don't understand how this works." "No," Ellie countered. "I understand perfectly. I understand that this cycle of violence has to stop somewhere, and it stops here. At my fence." She gestured to her property. The freshly painted barn, the mended fences, the thriving garden. Look around you. This is what peace looks like. This is what happens when people choose to build instead of destroy. Jack moved to stand beside her, his presence solid but non-threatening. "She's right, Marcus," he said to the leader. "I'm done with the old ways. I'm not your enemy anymore. But I'm not running either." Marcus studied them both, his expression unreadable. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, but neither Ellie nor Jack backed down. "You know what the code demands," Marcus said gruffly. "The code," Ellie interrupted, "is just another word for fear. Fear of looking weak, fear of losing control." She took a step closer to the fence. "But it takes more strength to walk away from a fight than to start one." Her words hung in the air. Behind Marcus, his 2 companions shifted uncomfortably. They looked different now, less like dangerous bikers, and more like men who were tired of carrying the weight of their reputations. Marcus's hard expression cracked slightly. He looked at Jack, then at Ellie, then back at his men. Finally, he let out a long breath. "You've changed, Thunder," he said, using Jack's old nickname. "Never thought I'd see the day." "We all can change," Jack replied quietly, "if we choose to." Marcus nodded slowly. He reached into his jacket, and for a moment, everyone tensed. But he pulled out only a bandana, Jack's old colors from when he rode with them. He laid it on the fence post. "Keep it," he said, "as a reminder of what you left behind." Ellie felt Jack relax beside her. The change in the atmosphere was palpable, like a storm cloud passing without breaking. Marcus mounted his bike, and his companions followed suit. "You've got something good here?" Marcus said, looking at them both. "Don't waste it." With that, they rode away, the sound of their engines fading into the distance. Ellie and Jack stood together by the fence, watching until they disappeared around the bend. "You did it," Jack said softly, taking her hand. "You found a way without violence." "We did it," Ellie corrected him, squeezing his hand. Together. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ellie's front yard as she and Jack shared coffee on the porch. The past few weeks had been quiet, almost too quiet, after the dramatic departure of the Hells Angels. The sound of distant motorcycles made them both look up, tension visible in their postures. A small group of riders approached, led by Vince "Grizzly" Tanner. Jack stood, moving slightly in front of Ellie, but there was no hostility in the bikers' approach. They parked their motorcycles in a neat line and dismounted with deliberate calm. "Easy, brother," Vince called out, raising his hands. "We're just here to tie up loose ends." Ellie watched as the massive man reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a thick envelope. Jack remained tense beside her, but his stance softened when Vince placed the envelope on the porch steps. "Your retirement fund," Vince explained, his voice gruff but sincere. "You earned it over the years, Thunder. We may not agree with your choice, but we respect it." Jack stared at the envelope, conflict evident on his face. "Vince, I can't." "You can and you will," Vince interrupted. "Use it to build something good here." His eyes flickered to Ellie, and a hint of a smile appeared beneath his thick beard. "Besides, we fixed up this place. Consider it an investment in its future." The other bikers began unloading boxes from their motorcycles, tools, spare parts, and even some home repair supplies. They worked efficiently, stacking everything neatly by the barn without saying a word. Ellie stepped forward, her hand finding Jack's. "Thank you," she said to Vince, her voice steady. "For understanding." Vince nodded, his expression softening slightly. "You changed him, ma'am. For the better." He turned to Jack. "The Black Riders won't be a problem anymore. We've reached an understanding with them." Relief washed over Jack's face, and Ellie felt some of the tension leave his body. The weight of constant vigilance began to lift from their shoulders. As the bikers prepared to leave, Vince extended his hand to Jack. After a moment's hesitation, Jack took it. The handshake was firm, a final acknowledgement of respect between old friends. "Take care of each other," Vince said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes the quietest lives are the ones worth fighting for." The bikers mounted their motorcycles, the engines roaring to life in unison. Vince gave one final nod before leading his crew away. The thunder of their departure gradually faded into the distance, leaving behind a profound silence. Jack picked up the envelope, turning it over in his hands. "I never thought they'd let go this easily," he admitted. Ellie squeezed his hand. "Maybe they understand that sometimes the bravest thing is choosing peace." Together, they watched the sun climb higher in the sky. The morning light painted everything in soft gold, making the dew on the grass sparkle. The air was clean and fresh, carrying the promise of a new day. The sound of birds returning to the yard replaced the memory of motorcycle engines. Life was settling back into its natural rhythm, but now it felt richer, more meaningful. Jack and Ellie moved about their morning routine, the simple acts of making breakfast and planning their day taking on a new significance. As they sat down to eat, Jack looked at Ellie with wonder in his eyes. "You know," he said softly, "I spent years thinking strength meant standing alone. But here, with you, I'm learning it means something else entirely."